Thank you everyone for being here. I'm AnaLouise Keating. We each will be introducing ourselves, and there's more about us on the website. I teach multicultural women's and gender studies up in North Texas at Texas Women's University. So because this conference is a little different, I thought it might be nice to start a little differently. So we're going to start with a little meditation. Meditation, visualization, it's an opportunity to tap into your imagination, come into the space, come into your body, just kind of settle down. So we'll start. Take a few breaths. You do not need to change your breath at all. Just notice it. And maybe you notice your body. Your body. How it changes, just tiny shifts between the inhale and the exhale. Maybe you expand your breath just a little bit if that feels good for you. And then notice all the places that you are touching the ground, your chair. Just noticing that place where you seem to stop and the other stuff begins. Simply observing. And then take your attention to your tailbone and imagine you have roots growing down through the building, through all the layers of earth. Whatever that looks like to you. One root, multiple roots. Notice them wandering around, getting deeper. And then notice those roots pulling up or just allowing powerful energy from deep within the earth, all the way up the roots, up to your pelvic bowl. Creating almost like a loop, goes through your tailbone, then back down. Powerful circuit of energy. And as that keeps cycling, think of a light a little bit above your head. It can be whatever color it is for you. Maybe no color. And imagine it coming down through the center of your head, down through your tailbone, through your spine, to your tailbone, joining that earth energy. So you have this mix, two different types of energy. Taking whatever form it takes for you. Just be curious. Let yourself imagine it. And then notice those energies mingling in whatever way they choose to mingle. And then with your next few breaths, imagine drawing them up through your body, through your lungs. And maybe out into the world, maybe through all the cells in your body. And then take about 4 more breaths and let it all go. And blink your eyes. Come back into the present moment. Alrighty then. I should have said something like, and then when you're done, roll your head so we know we're all done. Didn't think of that. So we are very informal in this session. We don't have prepared notes. In fact, when we were emailing ahead of time, we all agreed that we're not sure what para-ecology is. And we all agreed that that's part of the point of it, right? We're here to like think about creating knowledge. And if you look even at the words in the head up there, such a project is based on the wager that new theory lies hidden in the anomalous, that the paranormal appears in order to mock and shock us out of our present normal thinking. So we are going outside of our present normal thinking. We're probably all in various ways going a little bit outside of our own comfort zones to think about what para-ecology might mean, what we might do with it, what we might do next. I am like really tempted to not even offer any definition and just start down at the other end with Christine and just put her on the spot. So basically we're each going to talk for just a little bit, offering our definition or thoughts about what it might mean. And I will tell you, when I tried to Google the word para-ecology, I got something along the lines of someone who kind of does ecology but a little bit outside of ecology, like a paralegal. Right? So really we are truly doing something, I hope, new here as we creatively put together some thoughts. So each person will talk just a little bit, then we'll have a little bit of conversation maybe between us, but we'll open it up pretty quick so we can all just invent some new knowledge. Does that sound good? I'm going to punt to Christine.
All right, so I'm going to introduce myself. Christine Skolnik. I'm a retired academic. My department was writing rhetoric and discourse, but I also have academic and teaching credentials in environmental studies and sustainability. Now I spend most of my time as an environmental activist, and I do some writing, and I have a blog with Sam Stoeltje and Tim.
What's it called?
Para-Cultures, paracultures.com. Thank you. Okay, so yeah, as an environmentalist, I'm pretty invested in this topic. So I will try to keep it short, but earnestly announcing my topics. So for me, in an academic context, para-ecology suggests a mutual critique of paranormal studies and ecology. So first, from the ecological lens, critiquing paranormal studies, I would say that the topic of ecology demands a reckoning with anthropocentrism and anthropomorphisms, and I mean reified anthropomorphisms. You know, metaphors, stories, myths, all do really productive work. My second topic is questioning subject-object binaries, or more the necessary connection between subject and object. So borrowing from speculative realisms, considering what things are apart from how we know them, quoting from Levi Bryant's Democracy of Objects. So I see that as moving out of the epistemological cul-de-sac. Moving right along, the flip side would be examining the normal science of ecology from a paranormal studies lens. And my topics there are, I'm moving too fast now. Is ecology really a subfield of biology? Is it a science? Should it be? Should it be interdisciplinary? Should be really looking at really, really complex relationships between factors like climate, behavior, culture, myth, story, magic, I don't want to, I don't
Sorry, you could.
hauntings, right? And I was about to steal your topic, but, and so, yeah, this one is thanks to Tim Morton, who's here in spirit. I'm invoking him. Paranormal Studies calls upon us to conduct, I think, a very serious interdisciplinary critique of causality, or a critique of causality across the disciplines. Okay, so in ecology, we have nonlinear complex systems. What about non-material systems and causality, comparative causality, non-secular causality, causality as aesthetics, Tim Morton. And that's it.
That's so great. Yeah. Hi, everyone. I'm Sam Stoeltje. I'm really honored to be a part of this panel. I have a lot of respect for everybody sitting up here. So this is really special for me. I'm finishing my PhD here at Rice in the English department. And yeah, I don't know what I'm about to say. Para-Ecology. We had an email thread, and I did my etymology thinking, right? Para, eco is house. People talk about this a lot in eco-critical world. And, the para in this context is, maybe the impossible. The impossible is an interesting word. I went to thinking about the haunted house as a figure, and more than a figure. And I think that what I mean to say is the haunted house and haunting sort of have a lot of traction as figures for histories of violence and injustice, and rightfully so. And I think that people at this conference are interested in thinking in a non-figural, non-metaphorical way about the haunting, the surface of haunting, the experience of haunting. And what I'm interested in is thinking about those together at the same time, if that's possible. And that's very abstract. And to be more concrete, I mean to say the extent to which, when we say things like secular and materialist, the extent to which these terms have participated in violence on a geopolitical scale, colonialism and colonization, and in the United States, right? We're here on indigenous land. Houston, Texas is the historic dwelling place of the Karankawa and Atakapa Ishak peoples who were displaced from here. And we have our histories of displacement, indigenous displacement, and the slave trade, the chattel slave institution. And I'm thinking about the ways in which these kinds of violence were also cultural and ontological forms of violence, and whether we can think about coalitions. I feel like I'm getting abstract again. I don't know, hopefully that's enough in the air for me.
Thanks, Sam. I think I can pick up where you left off a little bit. I'm Simon Cox. I finished my PhD under Jeff in 2019, and I wrote a book called my dissertation was a genealogy of the subtle body, and it just came out through Oxford as the subtle body, a genealogy. And it's just a history of the concept of the subtle body, which was something I became interested in as just a normal 90s kid through cartoon media and stuff like that, and martial arts training since the age of 7. And when I was in my 20s, I moved to Wudang Mountain in central China and lived in a Taoist temple for 6 years. And I kind of just wanted to explore with more kind of rigor and sophistication the kind of altered states of energy and consciousness I was engaging in on a daily basis through training in Taoist regimens in a very structured way. And that's exactly what I did at Rice, and somehow it actually got published as a book. So I haven't figured out how that really happened yet. And I'm really honored to be on this panel and at this conference. This stuff is just the most relevant thing happening right now, I think, in all of academia, honestly. I don't think it's hyperbolic to say that. And we use all of these terms, paranormal and anomaly, nomos, like a law or order, so that without order. Paranormal, parapsychological, unidentified, impossible. So when we talk about a para-ecology, my sense was we have all of these prefixes that are just kind of fugitive, like we're running from these subjects because they've been violent, in the ways that Sam pointed out, and kind of dominant in really horrible ways. And it's kind of like postmodern. It's not modernism. No one agrees on what it is. Is its non-being central to the concept? Of course, this isn't a place to kind of wax poetic on the nature of postmodernism, though. When we talk about a para-ecology, I think we're talking about something where we're trying to escape the kind of very reductive scientific biases of our current zeitgeist, kind of reductive or even eliminative materialism, where there's no subjectivity anywhere except in here, or perhaps not even in here, and that there's just no subjectivity whatsoever, which is a kind of internally incoherent idea, in my opinion. And so a useful way to engage with this stuff is something that Jeff has laid out in his Authors of the Impossible. He looks at the paranormal genealogically and kind of traces the discursive formation of this category in the late 19th and early 20th century, kind of specifically situated in the heart of modernism, in this kind of North Atlantic context, specifically, Cambridge University, the center of the British Empire, which was kind of still the premier power at the time. So something that maybe can guide our flight from these outmoded categories is to acknowledge ologies outside of this particular modern North Atlantic context in which things like the paranormal came to exist. So my kind of home turf is Taoism and classical Chinese texts. And a cool thing about those is, China is a highly literate civilization with high levels of erudition, with a lot of traditions that never really passed the kind of exorcistic crucible of modernism, or weren't kind of reframed in the utilitarian language of English, which I think is inherently utilitarian in a lot of ways. So if we look at kind of Taoist ecologies, through this long history of nature mysticism that goes back 2 millennia in Taoism, we find these great troves of ecological lore, just like descriptions of rocks, minerals, stones, trees, plants, metals, and animals, and then side by side and totally inseparable from descriptions of the kind of spirits and intelligent forms of energy and consciousness that suffuse these mystical worlds. So there's nothing para about spirits in these Taoist contexts. In fact, it's the most normal thing in the world, as normal as holding a rock in your hand. And so, speaking of another traditional ecology, I recently moved to rural British Columbia, and I live halfway up Okanagan Mountain, which is at the heart of the Okanagan Nation, where they speak the Okanagan language, which is in the Syilx language family, which is an extremely complex language family full of phonemes that you can't possibly hear unless you were raised speaking it, lots of clicks and glottal stops and things like this. So it's not a super approachable language. And as far as I can tell, there's only one loan word from the Okanagan language that's made its way into the English language, and that word is Sasquatch. So I'm living in the kind of home of the Sasquatch, and pretty much every British Columbian over the age of 60, I would say, has a Sasquatch story. People from all walks of life. And within the kind of traditional Syilx or Okanagan context, Sasquatch doesn't stand alone. He's part of this huge panoply of what we would here term probably cryptids. Ogopogo lives in the Okanagan lake. It's a kind of Loch Ness Monster sort of thing. There's just a ton of these things. And once again, there's nothing para about them in their normal contexts. They're just a normal part of ecology and the world. So if I'm gonna make a point here. I guess it would be that these two traditional ecologies, the kind of Taoist and the Okanagan, are not alone in their profoundly para nature from our perspective. So I guess my proposal would be that as we ideally move from the kind of all to humanities that we live in right now into Jeff's kind of super humanities, that we loop in these robust traditional ologies into our thinking, because I mean these are kind of living archives that we can also kind of bring into conversation with these new kind of literary archives that we're creating in our universities through kind of comparative and genealogical methodologies. Thanks.
Try to see if they were going to clap for it. It started. Good afternoon, and that was all really helpful. I'm Stephen Finley, inaugural chair of the Department of African and African American Studies at Louisiana State University. I did a second master's degree and PhD right here at Rice University. I'm always really, really happy to be back here and to stay in contact with the people who influenced my thinking to such a great extent. And speaking of that, Simon says he was one of my first students at when I taught. It had to be world religions.
Yeah, it was intro to religions.
Yeah, at the University of Houston. All right, so I'm going to try to say something somewhat reflecting everything I've heard, but also thinking out loud, particularly from my own social location. When I think about ecology and para-ecology, as an African American male in particular, I think about that demographic that doesn't always have the benefit of ecological thinking. What I mean by that is that African American men in particular are often seen as flat and not complicated, such that the social issues that we talk a lot about, that this world highlights, aren't given the sort of complicated ecological explanations of other groups. Speaking of being reductionistic, the behavior, patterns, issues of African American men are often reduced to pathology, and that alone. And so trying to think about my particular social location, which is often seen as, again, not flat, historically understood as criminal, and so on, in light of the paranormal and what that might mean. What is then a para-ecology from such a perspective? I'm not sure that I can answer that question. But when I think about ecology and para-ecology, I'm thinking about how systems and things are connected, such that we can't think of linear cause and effect, but we must think in much more complicated ways. And with respect to the para or the paranormal, what then is it that ties us all together? What runs through all of these systems and things that we want to understand as an ecology that then allows us to think of the universal and the particular? That's kind of the direction I'm going with this. How might we think about consciousness, or whatever we want to call it, that exists, in which everything is connected, and yet also put in tension these embodied realities in which experiences are very, very different? I don't know how to answer that question, which is maybe why I'm posing the question to all of you. What would such a para-ecology look like that took the universal and the particular seriously, that wanted to understand systems that are interconnected, things that are interconnected by something, and that something is universalizing, perhaps egalitarian and democratizing, and yet to live in this world in which people are embodied who have very, very different experiences. And by that, again, I'm talking about race, gender, sexual orientation, culture, and so on. What would such a para-ecology look like? How might we think about that in useful and helpful ways? And maybe I'll just stop right there.
Wow. Thanks. I think we should give everybody a hand because I think that was really good. So I'm going to say a couple things, also kind of trying to thread some of what's been said, and then we'll see if anybody wants to say anything. I hope lots of people will. So first of all, I want to point out, I think, and I meant to look again, ours is the only session that doesn't have the word impossible in the title. I just want to claim, therefore, that means that this is possible. Because it doesn't, like... Anyways, and my own interest is very much in social justice. And one of my, like the book I will be working on very soon, I'm kind of working on it, is on womanist spiritual activism. And it's really it's thinking about how can we bring what I call a metaphysics of radical interconnectedness into our social justice work and into everything we do, whether it's teaching or research or taking care of our kids or you name it. What would it mean to really think about everybody, not just human bodies, everybody and everything is radically interconnected, because we actually are, but because of how Western epistemologies work and because of how we've interpreted Descartes and all of that, we have a hyper-individualism. It's not just individualism that's relational, it's hyper, and we just see all those boundaries around us, right? We see the enclosures, and then it's not even like, you know, that whole rhetoric of like, everyone is an individual and we have equality. Like, we know we don't, right? We don't have equality. Instead, we have a ranking, what really constitutes an individual, and it just kind of goes on down with all those classic human identity categories. And that's much of the West, and that's how many, if not all of us in this room were educated. But when we can get outside of our box, and when we can, you know, and this is part of then what also to get away from that anthropocentrism that centers the human, because it's not really centering all humans, although even all humans, like, that's still not going to work. We do need to get more expansive. It's centering a certain kind of human. Anyways, when we can get outside of our Western training and really look at some of these ancient traditions that are so much older than the Enlightenment and all of that, and realize that there's these very different ways of being and very different ways of thinking and knowing, that's part of what we need to do as part of that shift. But then how do we work with our beyond human allies? How can we work with them to enact social justice, to create new knowledge? I mean, I'm probably not the only person in this room who I would swear to you, there are some rocks I talk to, and I know, they talk back to me, right? Like, but that's like a really weird thing to say, especially if you're an academic, you know? So like, don't tell my colleagues, I'm not sure I mentioned I'd be at this conference, but I did like post about it, so they probably know. Anyways, so I love the fact that we have this invitation with all these like really brilliant people to start thinking differently about some of this stuff, right? To not just think about it, not just talk about it, not just write about it, those are all great things, but also how can we act on it? How can we take these different ways of thinking and knowing and really do some work in the three-dimensional world, which is part of reality, which of course is much more complex and multidimensional than we usually think of. So any thoughts on any of that? Anybody?
I'll chime in, I guess. Thanks. That's a brilliant response to everyone. I mean, I think the humanities, at their best, teach people to think or perhaps even be outside of the confines of their inherited material historical condition, you know, and this is why it's absolutely corrosive to things like ethno-nationalism, right? Because once you can see outside of the world that's been handed to you, the whole thing, kind of relativity of different worldviews becomes just an obvious fact. So yeah, I mean, engaging with this stuff historically, I mean, in a kind of like, since the Renaissance, we'd had these kind of like very Greco-Roman world that would be your kind of counterpoint to your inherited, you know, normative Christian world. But now things are really opening up, and I think that Para-Ecologies is kind of an idea that can encapsulate this. We're not just thinking beyond our little historical condition, we're thinking beyond even our human condition in kind of capacious ecological terms, hopefully.
Anyone else?
Stephen, your question about taking the universal and the particular seriously, I've been haunted by that for at least 2 decades, probably. And some of my thinking about that is if the universal remains abstract, then it's less likely to be reduced to a world in which one view is privileged, like one world or worlds. And I draw inspiration from, ancient monotheisms in that really resist the old type of anthropomorphisms. Is that making any sense? I mean, if the universal remains like so abstract and so spiritual that it's not made in anybody's image, or it's not one person's home, I think that can be freeing, and I'd love to talk to people at some point about
Yeah, so would I.
monotheisms. I don't want to privilege that, but
Right. No, I'm thinking they're going to have to help us too, because I don't even know how to respond to what you're saying. I don't know how to think about this, about a para-ecology that takes seriously, the universal in particular, such that justice was just sort of a matter of fact. And, the way we live and the way we see the world. And I think to a certain extent, I don't want to speak for Jeff, but I think that's in part what his project is about. I had an opportunity to read, I guess it's sort of an advanced copy of Humanities. And I see something going on in that project that's closely related to what I think I'm trying to get to. How can we reimagine, I think you said it, what it means to be human, which is, again, a really fraught, I think Sam pointed it out too, a really fraught category. But how can we reimagine what that category means with all its problems? And I have a lot of problems with it because of, who was included and who wasn't included, over against this idea that there's something more in the world. And something, to Jeff's point, that these social and historical categories, as important as they are, and they are important, don't really get us to. Like, there's something else. Mm-hmm. There's something more. Mm-hmm. And so I'm trying to think through, in that context, what such an ecology and world might look like if we took all of that seriously. And again, I just don't know. These are questions. But I started off with my own social location because, I'm impacted by the question and by the issue in very real and often concrete ways. And so not only do I think about this these matters from my social location, as we all do, they become even more important in some ways because of that. So again, I don't know. I appreciate the help. I'm trying to think through it. But I do know one more thing before anybody responds. I do know that the category of the human hasn't always done that for me. Hasn't always seemed to do the sort of heavy lifting. Now maybe the superhuman is a way of rescuing the human in a way that hasn't served all populations to sort of engender and bring about a certain equality and justice. And so I'm trying to think about that too at the same time.
Yeah, to continue in that mode of thought, and this is not, what I'm about to say is not original insights on my part, but really me just paraphrasing what I've read of Sylvia Wynter, but she's a scholar who's really concerned with how the human has been defined within dominant intellectual culture, which is, a European intellectual culture. And she has, a sort of very rich and detailed kind of narration of that process. But an important part of it for her, post 1492 and, post Descartes, is the idea of reasoning, and reason being a criterion for the human, for being acknowledged as human. And I think that I have many sort of conflicted feelings about the sign of reason and many things it has done, and different definitions that people have for it, and the different ways that it's used. But one of the ways that it's used is a way of sort of distinguishing from superstition and from determining what is not real. And how does this connect? I think that this is part of the reason why this conversation, like proposing some of the metaphysical conversations that we're having, why these have such large stakes, especially when I think we still, in Wynter's narration, we move beyond the ratiocentric onto episteme to be really, really jargony about it. But I think, she would say, or I think, we feel that we do also still, to some extent, live in that world, a world in which reasoning is really privileged in a toxic way. I don't know if toxic is the word I want there, but yeah.
So Gloria Anzaldúa, who wrote many books, including Borderlands, La Frontera de Nu Mestiza, and everybody should read it. She has, one of her theories is a theory of the Trojan mula, kind of like a Trojan horse, but she's Chicana, so she had to change it up a little bit to fit her own experience better. And it's that idea, just like they wheeled the horse into Troy and then they infiltrated. I think some of these kinds of conversations, or even using words like episteme or stuff like this, that's what it is. It's getting inside more quote unquote normal or accepted ways of talking and making the change from there, and making it slowly. And I don't think, I think we probably would be really deluding ourselves if we thought we could just come up with the theory of this or come up with the better definition. I think it's going to be lots of really small stuff, And a lot of times the whole universal particular, I like to just think about commonalities. Like, how could we think different about commonalities? Not sameness. Sameness it doesn't work. Sameness doesn't work because we're not the same. But what are some of the commonalities, and how can we work from there to think about things like universals or particulars? Should we open it up?
Sure.
Okay. So what do y'all think about anything we've said?
Did that make sense?
I have a theory. I don't know how useful it'll be, but I'll roll it out anyway because nobody else is saying anything, at least among my colleagues over here. I think we're in a state of evolution right now as a human or superhuman group that we're talking about. And the evolution is from a perspective that's tribally oriented. So you have lots of people that have a sort of a tribal framework towards more of a universal framework. Now what does that mean in terms of a level of abstraction? The difference between these two frameworks is that the tribal framework, it's how these frameworks view authority. From the tribal point of view, it's more like from the outside in. So embedded in that is hierarchy, dominance, and all of that sort of stuff. Patriarchy also. The universal, it's more like from the inside out. The people like that insist on defining reality for themselves. They don't accept outer authority just carte blanche. Whether it's in healthcare, they want to question their doctors. What do you mean? I don't believe this. Even in business, there used to be a tendency towards maybe not so much more 12 self-managed work teams kind of thing. So I think as a species, we're trying to deal with this evolution We don't have the answer to the question that Professor Cox, we don't know how to, because all of us embody the tribal and the universal inside of ourselves. We have the sort of the tribal rage, we have the tribal challenges, we have the difficulties of particularism. So how do we get to the place so that we can embody these sort of more universal tendencies and at the same time honor the particular tendencies?
Just from a semantic perspective, I really don't like equating tribal with hierarchy. Just a lot of social groups that describe themselves as tribes, I think, actually set a lot of examples for sort of non-hierarchical social organization. Just wanted to say that.
But that idea of shifting from more externally imposed authority into a more inner, although, yeah, that definitely for both the positive and like the dangers. I mean, like some of the QAnon stuff and things that people believe are just like, you know, what one of my partner heard in class, a student said, the government is giving away crack pipes to everybody. I mean, like, and completely believed it. Like, you know, it's an amazing time with what constitutes knowledge and how people are discerning what constitutes knowledge and how they believe it. It's both an opportunity and a challenge, and yeah. But thank you for that.
Hello?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you, all of you, for talking. I really appreciate it. I've been thinking about para-ecologies for a while now also as a methodology rather than a space to be studied, but a way to study. And there's a contemporary post-philosophical device known as Xenofeminism, and the platform for that is more so liminality than bridges, and trying to translate the gaps between the particular and the universal rather than getting rid of those gaps. So if you think of Pera as kind of the outside and around, and then ecology as networks across, you start to get para-ecology as networks of the outside in between, because the absence is already actual, but the translation is still virtual. It's still missing. So it's opening up what's already there so it can be something that's already been there. And that's not a question, obviously, but it's kind of my methodological approach with a more established content approach. And there's not really a conversation between religious studies and what kind of goes into the religious studies rhizome now and philosophy and critical theory yet. And that's where you kind of get the superhumanities things. So a start, at least, it's already there. We just have to find it.
Drop the mic.
Thank you.
That was great.
So I don't have a response so much as to say I appreciate this idea of one way of thinking about para-ecologies as methodological. It's something to think about further. Thank you.
Yeah, I really like, I'm still thinking about the radical metaphysics of interconnectedness. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that is a methodology, and I don't know if that what that, how do we practice that? I certainly, am very sympathetic to translations from different knowledge communities. And to the addition to the ones that you mentioned, I wanted to also just mention, I feel like radical anthropology, certain kinds of radical anthropology, have something to add to this conversation, particularly theories of cognitive justice. Yeah, that's all.
Did not know that was a thing.
Well, thank you. I agree with a lot of what the last two questioners said about that we're in the midst of evolution, and also that think of para-ecology as a methodology, a way to study. I was just sitting here, though, because I became I feel like Pera's gotten a bad rap, the word para. And as you were all talking, and even earlier in the conference, I started looking up the etymology of para, which came from the Greek. And I'm really surprised we have not had a discussion about the whole etymology of para. It's a very, very versatile word, right? And a versatile word is a great thing for a time of evolution and a time of change. I'm sure you're aware it came from the Greek, which actually meant next to, beside, side by side with. And then at some point it went into the French idea of against, right? Which came from a Latin root. But it's an amazing word, and in many ways, now that I understand the origin of the word, it's not an inappropriate word. So it's not against the normal, it's beside, along with the normal. So it's not against the ecology, it's along with the ecology, right? So I just wanted to throw that out there.
But I think that's what some of the folks up here, they're trying to get at something similar. Like, how can we not see things as so distinct, but tied together in a world in which we privilege difference? Right, and so, just really trying to think about para-ecology seriously, given those kind of ideas.
In a world where we privilege oppositional difference.
Yeah.
So it's this or that, me or you, us or them, all of those oppositions, as opposed to thinking relationally.
Right.
Yeah, and we're trying relationally in that liminal way, and para kind of, in that liminal way.
Sorry, one thing that came up, the speaker at the back, you should have dropped the mic. Sorry. This wasn't a Rice mic. It wasn't Jeff's mic. I would have dropped it for you. But, one thing, we can think of the universal without longing, right, desiring, like pining for a unified theory. So one of my obsessions, as some of you know, is Henri Bergson, right? So you could think of the universal as, a radical multiplicity, radical heterogeneous, right? And actually, right? And not like infinite, like we can tie it up in a bow. A consciousness that was like a radical multiplicity, right? So it wasn't just a projection of our image of our consciousness. And that would, when you were speaking, I was just thinking of, chaos and gaps. And I don't know if you said interstitial spaces or something between liminal. That's what liminal, ooh, sublime haunted house. I'll just trail off there.
And if I can chime in with indulge me in a very nerdy foray into the para and its etymology. If we think of it in its kind of ancient Greek term, in Euclid, for example, his fifth postulate is called the parallel lines postulate. And to put it really simplistically, it's about how parallel lines will never meet. And this was a problematic postulate from antiquity. Ancient Greek, Roman mathematicians, Islamic mathematicians all critiqued this, saying that Euclid had sort of put a theorem where he actually said it was a postulate. And it wasn't until the 19th century that this was really explored in depth when Riemann kind of created what we think of as hyperdimensional geometry now. And now we all talk about the fourth and fifth and 12th and so on dimensions. And we often extrapolate these kind of paranormal phenomena into higher dimensions as a way of explaining them. So I think para in this term, maybe when I'm talking about kind of the ecologies of Taoists and Selic peoples, they kind of have long since abandoned Euclid's fifth postulate in their own worlds. And so these things that kind of are on parallel tracks in our culture, which are the kind of inspirited dimensions of nature, and then kind of nature is just like, trees and atoms and stuff like that. These are actually totally together in most traditional human contexts throughout history. So we're the kind of unique ones in putting these things on separate tracks that never meet. So I guess as para-ecologists, let us abandon Euclid's fifth postulate and proceed into this brave world. Yeah, thanks.
Should I go ahead? I first of all, thank you so much say each of you. I really appreciate everything each of you is bringing to the table and the conversation as a whole. I'm thinking about something I've heard from Jeff actually about UFOs, that UFOs are not just about technology, they're about eschatology. And I'm thinking, as I'm sitting here listening to you all, that to think about ecology in this moment is also to implicitly consider some form of eschatology. Mm-hmm. And so I'm thinking about, how considering, to look at ecology is to look at ecosystems either on the brink of destruction and cataclysm or in the midst of it. And also not just the imminent end of worlds, but with many groups of people, perhaps some of the indigenous groups mentioned, for people for whom the world has already ended in some meaningful way. So how do we engage ecology or para-ecology with this in mind? And the other part of it is that it seems, and I'm really struck by this sense of the metaphysic of radical interconnectedness, that it seems like oftentimes the narrative right now around ecology and the climate crisis, it's just continuing to try to recycle the existing narrative of what's possible, and it's just reinscribing the same narrative devices that have gotten us into the predicament in the first place. We just keep reinscribing them because we're only willing to look within the paradigm of what's possible. And so my sense is that really if there's going to be something beyond the end of worlds, it has to come from the realm of the impossible, at least what seems impossible within the current episteme, within the current paradigm. And so I'm just really interested what any of you might have to say about that.
I don't know what I would have to say other than what you've already said. And I hope some of that was implied in what I was trying to push. I mean, I'm not looking to reinscribe all the current stuff, like you suggest, into something else. And I don't mean to be too Afro-pessimistic, but I mean, what we need is a new world. I mean, something new. This has to end, right? I'm not looking for any kind of traces of this in some kind of future reality. And maybe that's where the paranormal comes in, or the para of this ecology. That, and again, I think I'm pushing for that it has to come from, like you say, the impossible realm. And to think that for many groups, the world has ended on multiple times, but we've simply reinscribed the same old stuff and recreated new world in the image of the old world.
Which is a failure to learn, right? And then learning, right? Like our responsibility, those of us who are educators, to teach. And I also really enjoyed that question and comment. And I had a slogan. I'll wrap up quickly just to say the possible is political. Maybe that's we could put that on a T-shirt.
So, I don't know if there's there's not. There's not gonna be like one big answer that could solve. Here we go. Here it is. What are the little things we can do to get there? Because we absolutely need to. We're like, and anyone? I started talking about a metaphysics of radical interconnectedness, and I started bringing it into my scholarship and my teaching to start challenging the hyper-individualism, because I think that hyper-individualistic way of thinking is so damaging. But that's just like super small. It's just like what I can do in my daily life. What are other ideas?
I was just teaching. I'm teaching a class about prison, and the lesson. I'm trying to introduce them to abolitionist politics, and the students are very easy to convince that there's something very wrong with our carceral state. But then the question of what do we do, and what can abolitionist politics look like, was something we were talking about today, and people are talking about how it means getting to know your neighbors and building community, around you, and just reacting to the idea of small things we can do.
Hey, In this talk of consciousness, subtle bodies, Greek roots, even pessimism and speaking with rocks, we find panpsychism and animism making raging comebacks. Mm-hmm. People approaching both that maybe wouldn't have touched either in years past. Both seem potentially useful frameworks when we think about these para-ecological subjects. What are the overlays you see? Are there particularly useful or even unhelpful ways for either or both to be brought into the conversation about our particular ecological and para-ecological precipice?
Can I jump in on this? I feel like, because also combining with the last guy's one, I feel like the eschaton we've arrived at, and I feel like we're all feel like we're kind of living in like a slow rolling eschaton right now, and most people would rather just like speed it up and kind of like get on to the next thing, you know? And it's really a kind of epistemological eschaton where we've arrived at the kind of like terminus point of an objectivist epistemology, as Eduardo Viveros de Castro coins the term in Cannibal Metaphysics, where every subject you see around you is actually just an insufficiently analyzed object. So subjectivity is erased in this worldview, which leading eventually to the kind of like Churchland-style eliminative materialism, which, as I said before, is internally incoherent. And so, yeah, now there's this kind of this new panpsychism on the rise and animism, and I think it's really this sort of just resubjectivization of ourselves and of the world, and hopefully of each other. And speaking of little things we can do, just recognizing the subjectivity that inheres in individuals, and if your kind of ecological scope is wide enough to include trees and grass and that sort of thing as ethical subjects as well, then all the better.
So I don't always want to be the shit starter. I just wonder. I just wonder how effective that can be, like in this current situation. Like I really want to believe that that's going to make a difference. Sort of a panpsychic view. We're all tied together by consciousness. There's this universal oneness. But I mean, I don't have a question. I just wonder. And again, I'm thinking in part from the perspective of my community and indigenous communities, that even categories like the human didn't do a whole lot of work for us. So again, it's not a question. It's just sort of a skepticism that I can never really get away from. I want to see this world end. Right, to your point. Sometimes I have to be careful how I say that. I actually did a podcast with a couple colleagues, one of whom did his PhD at Rice University, Biko Gray, and we were talking about Afro-pessimism. Afro-pessimism argues something similar, that this world has to end. It has to be raised, that these structures, within these structures, the kind of flourishing that we're talking about here, the kind of potential flourishing of all human beings, of the environment and so on, it's just not possible. We need something new. And Biko Gray said something about we need to destroy this world. And I thought I had to come behind him to explain, because I didn't want him to be seen in this age as like a terrorist or someone who was advocating, the destruction of all things. But I mean, I really mean that when I say that we need something totally new, and I don't know what that means. Panpsychism, is helpful. I mean, I dig it. I really do. I just wonder. I mean, I really do. I wonder how, even in such a view, like how that moves us still to get there. I mean, I don't know. I mean, you feel free to respond if you like. Okay.
All right. So I'll respond.
All right.
Mimi.
All right.
I will present Visionary Pragmatism, Patricia Hill Collins, right? We be pragmatic and we be visionary simultaneously. I don't think it's like there's not a reset button, right? Getting anywhere else is going to take a lot of time and a lot of hard work. At least it will look like a lot of time to those of us who are embodied in, whatever. But I do wonder how many small local actions might even be happening now that we're not aware of, and how many more could happen. Or say a group works with the local spirits to do something. I mean, these are like small things, but I think it's just going to take like a snowball. It's going to take a lot of small things. Or I think we need to remind ourselves an earthquake is not suddenly the plates moved. It's a ton of tiny little things. And every time I get super depressed about all of this, I just try to keep reminding myself of one of the teachings. I think it's in chaos theory too, right? It's just lots of little stuff that eventually can add up. Like, I don't know, I have to have that hope that the little things, and we just need to think of more technologies to make more of these little things that are going outside the box, maybe using panpsychism, or working with different ways of thinking.
Yeah, I mean, and you've probably figured out, hope for me is in short supply in this world, although I do try to, I mean, so there's even a hope implied in that I think a new world is possible and necessary. So it is sort of implied, and to your point, I appreciate the little steps that we take, and whatever gets us there, really, I would appreciate.
They're just so damn small, I know. Yeah. He has his hand up, and then is there...
Can I just briefly, to this last question, I told myself I would say something during this panel, because I figured that a question like this would come up, and I think that the term and concept of animism, it is emerging in academic discourses. I wanted to situate this a little bit because it's happening in academic spaces. Intellectuals are like, animism, and I'm not going to say no to the world being full of spirits. I love that. But we should think about animism as a concept with a genealogy that it was weaponized, right? Animism is used to devalue other cultures and in academic spaces. And now academics are like, oh, actually we changed our minds. We like animism now. And I'm not, all I'm saying is I think that a lot of self-critique is required there, if that's a motion that people want to make.
So I had a question. I had gotten up to use the restroom before I came back, but briefly earlier in the conversation, we mentioned redefining what it means to be human, because what has been defined as human has been exclusionary for so many groups of people for so long. And so if not the Western idea of reasoning, then how would we redefine what it is to be human in a way that better suits the world that we are hoping for?
Is that for me?
For anyone on the panel.
Because that might be better for my colleagues. I'm not, because for me, I'm not so sure, unless it's a concept like the superhuman that somehow jumps over this modern notion of the human. I might just be better off just getting rid of the concept. For me, it hasn't really done the kind of work to guarantee, again, the kind of things we're talking about, the kind of flourishing and justice, appeals to the human, hasn't done that because, again, it's hierarchical, like you suggest. I'm just not so sure how useful that category is. Maybe my colleagues have something else to add about that. I'd rather jettison the term in lieu of something like the superhuman, which is kind of dependent on it, but maybe not, because again, in Africa, for example, during colonialism, they were never quite fully human, and I'm not sure if they've ever really entered the human in the way that might be useful, that might have some ontological weight to do the kind of work that we're talking about. So it's a term that I always stand outside of and over against.
I think maybe one thing we could do is just stop thinking of humans as so different from other animals. I mean, maybe part of it is a reset, so we think of us in more relational terms with all living beings, as we also continue to take apart what has constituted the human to show the biases and the narrowness and the history of how we got there. And then maybe together that would give us information and insight to either come up with a different definition or jettison. I mean, superhuman is kind of hierarchical, so I'm a hierarchy. I'm like, no, we have, I grew up in a very religious family. No more hierarchy for me, please. But the start is just like seeing the limits, I think.
So anthropologically speaking, and if we assume that para-ecology implicates that there is data or phenomena that exist beyond our current understanding, if there are practical applications that we can use to interface with that field of data, based upon what we know in history when civilizations interact with different bases of knowledge, ecological knowledge, without them succumbing to assimilation, what are some practical disciplines that we can utilize in order to bridge that gap? Some that come to mind might be language, music, art, mathematics. This is open to the panel to respond.
I'm not sure if this is an answer to your question, but it's provoked my thoughts about this, and it resonates with things that have been said. So I guess the way I think of the human, and maybe this is a technology or a language, humans have a lot in common, obviously, with non-human animals, plants, minerals. We are non-human animals, plants, minerals, right? In our gut biome would be nowhere without our, hosting plants and minerals as well. But a problem that I've had with the narratives that we've inherited is that we bestow what we call human characteristics on non-humans, whether they be non-human animals on Earth or terrestrial beings, right? So we own language, we own tools, and we bestow these things on non-human creatures. If you look at archaeology, we see that our non-human ancestors used tools. So humans didn't make tools, tools made humans, right? It was like manipulating tools. Mm-hmm. And when I think about, what we have in common, I think of indigenous cultures where non-human animals are our ancestors, and hierarchically they're above us, right? So we kind of mess up this hierarchy. But then also the future non-human, the time loop non-human, obviously, in a time loop, we would have something in common with future humans, extraterrestrials, etc. So for me, and it's like old school religious humility. It's okay to be human. Just get off the podium, get off the pedestal. And one last thing I'll say is, as I interact more and more with non-human beings, the first moment, they made the technology, my first moment is those bears interacting look human, I'm charmed, right? Or, wow, that tree has branches like I have lungs, I'm charmed by the similarities. But the more I engage with the non-human, the more I see I am similar to them. Like, I don't see myself in a mirror. I see, they are kind of, I've lost myself. I mean, I don't see the human characteristics in them. I see the non-human characteristics in myself. So I think, and when I do see that, it's not visual, it's not perceptive, it's not oral. It is something that I kind of feel more in the solar plexus. So I think you can get partly out of this human cul-de-sac by just truly engaging with the non-human.
Yeah, I'm trying to wrestle with all these ideas. Wow. Thank you to the panel for bringing up all these ideas, and they're bouncing around without any logic in my head. But I keep coming back to the word impossible, actually, in part because it's staring at all of us on the screen above you. But I think the word impossible is kind of interesting in this context because I think there's a way in which it's subversive in a way. that it kind of frustrates the categories that we have. It subverts kind of the social system that we have on the one hand. And I don't know, Stephen, maybe this kind of speaks to the ways that you or that all of us want to get rid of kind of an older system and reimagine a different kind of system. So I think on the one hand, it has a kind of subversive power to it, this word impossible. On the other hand, when I think about the impossible things that we talk about in this group, I think about, what do I think about? I think about UFO narratives, paranormal stuff. I think about maybe two things. One is being plotted into a story that we didn't know we were plotted into. I know Jeff talks about this a lot. There's a story that we don't know about. There's a narrative about our lives that gives us purpose and maybe gives us hope. So I think about maybe that as the second move of the impossible. And let's see, one more thing I had written down about the impossible. And some of you have mentioned it already. The other element of the impossible, when I think about it, I actually don't think about the impossible equals universal. I actually think about the impossible as interconnection. And I think in the concepts of sort of like a renewed sense of purpose and narrative, and in the concept of a renewed sense of interconnection, there maybe is a chance for folding up kind of the old stuff in ecology and social order and opening up different newer possibilities.
Yes.
Right.
Agreed.
Yeah. I don't know if this is relevant, but I, think about the politics of the possible, and the possible is an intersection between ontology and epistemology, and, what kinds of knowledge we recognize as legitimate and how that might affect what can be. And I feel like this relates also to I keep bringing in other sort of theorists, but Mark Fisher's concept of capitalist realism, which is getting a lot of currency lately, the idea, being inside of capitalism, one of the things that capitalism wants to do is sort of tell us that this is the only possible kind of world, right? And I feel like that's true, and that there are other kinds of realisms. There are other realisms that are doing that same kind of work in the different systems and structures that we exist within.
Just very quickly, so I'm a huge fan of Elizabeth Grosz. I think her book is Time Loops now, but I'm not sure because we have another time loop person in the audience. But Elizabeth Grosz and the genealogy of Deleuze and Bergson, and read this stuff. So they make a distinction between the virtual and the actual, and the possible and the real. And the basic argument, starting with Bergson, is that the real is the real, which is political, epistemological. The real precedes the possible, right? We don't start with an infinite number of possibilities and then call the real from it. Our preconceived notions of the real constrict the possible. And the alternative pairing is the actual and the virtual. But as I say, Elizabeth Grosz, well worth the read.
Well, Chris,
Time travels.
Thank you for helping us think through this. I mean, these are complicated conversations with a lot of jargon. And I appreciate you pushing us to try to think through and beyond some of this, because I think the impossible, I see that as something really significant, as potential to the problems that we're all wrestling with. Like I think when I think of the humanities and the impossible, I think of the new ontologies and take them very, very seriously. And but there's still the question. I mean, we talk about these ideas and then certain ethical questions, and there's still the question for me that we've been discussing: how do we get there? Maybe that's what I'm stuck on. Like maybe that's really what I can't get my mind around, and maybe what I don't need to get my mind around. Right? How do we get to these new ontologies of the impossible, such that we can fantasize and envision a new world that we can bring into existence that isn't like this one. I don't know, but I appreciate the questions and those of everyone else who are helping us think through it.
There's one up there, then one right here, and then one right here.
So from my understanding of what's being discussed, it seems like working towards developing a more nuanced and inclusive understanding of how things could potentially be functioning. And I just would love to hear anyone's thoughts on like the, rather than creating something that's like trying to be a more nuanced and inclusive version of the map that exists, if there's a place for the intentional implantation of active irrationality that would sort of disrupt and maybe, I don't know, dissolve spaces in the system as opposed to adding more nuance to it.
Intentional what?
And active, right? Active irrationality.
Active intentional irrationality on the part of. Yeah. Well, but I'm trying to. I couldn't
Very
quite hear. I'm
subject
trying to hear if you were saying like the president.
I feel like it was like everybody, right?
Everybody, right?
Yeah, just
okay.
just the act of like dropping a irrationality bomb.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I think the whole conference is like doing that, or do you have ideas in mind yourself?
Yeah, I mean, lying is an example. I think, I don't know, I think about Carlos Castaneda and how there's, that sort of like blurry line between like what's mythology and what's lying and what's just something that I can't perceive because I haven't experienced it. But I definitely think there's like some lies in there, And yeah, George Hansen talks about this. The shaman was a healer, but sometimes he just lied, Sometimes it was mythology and sometimes it was just like, this is what needs to be said. And I'm not even saying like towards some like aim of like betterment or healing, but just like, I can't like put it into words, but like, I don't know. Yeah, a moment of like nonsense, the intentional like creation of nonsense, and not in like a safe, like we're gonna be nonsensical now and like use that as like a thought exercise, but like active nonsense, right? Taken very seriously.
Yeah, I love your question. I think this definitely pertains to the formulation of what it's sort of or like a unidentified flying ontology that we're trying to create here or whatever. And I think like in a lot of our discussion here, it seems like we're stuck in this kind of like Gnosticism trap that's just so seductive, where like the world we're in is just irredeemable, and we want to create the new one, but it's just around the corner. Not every worldview is a Gnostic worldview. Gnostic is kind of a chapter in kind of like human intellectual discourses. And a lot of other worldviews, like you bring up Castaneda, and he's very much in this much more, I would say, kind of like dream ontology realm, where reality is a dream. And the world is not irredeemably corrupt, but it's also not just like a shining golden paradise. And everything is sort of an illusion. And as George Hansen, brilliantly demonstrates in The Trickster and the Paranormal, the trick always hides the truth. So yeah, I think we have to think outside of the confines of the kind of seductive Gnosticisms of our past. And that's why I just talk about looking at other kind of traditional cosmologies and ecologies, because they kind of allow us to think in broader terms. So thanks for bringing up Castaneda. I wanted him to come up in this panel.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question. And I'm writing about Castaneda. Perhaps I shouldn't be, but I am. And I think that like wrapped up in your question and like the idea of the irrational, the word irrational, what it means is like, I think I'm generally like sympathetic with using non-rational tactics. But your question, you brought up lying, and I think that like with the word irrational, there's a sort of valence there of harm, you know. And Castaneda, he started off bending the truth and fabricating with his first book. But by the end of his career, he was an abusive and manipulative leader of a very toxic, you know, new religious movement. And so as we consider engaging with the irrational, I think we just need to have an eye trained on ethics really carefully.
That's what I was saying. I think she had her hand up back there, and then there was someone over here.
Thank you. Just a brief kind of comment. AnaLouise, I loved how you brought up this question of what can we do, right? Because in such a like venerable academic setting with so many people really thinking and examining the past and thinking about the future, we can get really stuck in that space and not in the what can I do, right? And over the pandemic, that's been really one of my themes is how do you dispel the depression or the anxiety or the fear? It's like, what can I do right now? And I think that to your point, you know, I have 2 small children now, which is amazing. And also, you know, you get to these points with them where they're asking about the world, or they're asking about why is it like this, or what does that mean? And when we start, especially in this room, there's so much education and so much high thought process to be able to really learn to express your thoughts without fear and express your worldview without fear and with this in a state of radical inclusivity, right? So that as you're expressing it to the people around you, to your children, to your children's friends, to your friends, to your parents' friends, you know, you have this moment of, I'm not excluding you, I'm including you, and we're all going to bring each other along together. It's that when we think about that para-ecology as radical inclusivity, radical interconnectedness, that's kind of the way I look at that as what can I do? Like, I'm a piece of this earth, so I can start by improving this piece of earth, and then the piece of earth that I live on, and then the pieces of earth that are around me, I can begin to improve, and that has dramatic interconnected effect. And so when I think about what can we do, it is that community building piece. It is that piece of focusing on yourself and the people directly around you so that you can continue to have that exponential effect around you. And Stephen, to your point about Afro-pessimism or just pessimism in general in this world, I hear you, and I also feel like this is truly part of the cure.
Yeah, thank you for that. As you were talking, I was, and I know we only have a few minutes, I have to get to other questions. I was also thinking about the point Christopher made too. And I think what I was thinking about was, and we'll come back to this later, after this we can talk more about this, Chris, was how we're all interconnected by something universal. That's what I think I was trying to get to.
So there's a lot of hands. Who was right here was next, and then there's someone over here that I didn't see.
They die down over the
So first off, I want to say one of my remote viewing students was Carlos Castaneda's last live-in girlfriend. So unless somebody here has actually met Carlos Castaneda, then I win the 6 degrees of separation game. So, okay. So I also want to make a point. Mark Twain once said he didn't believe in reading health books because he's afraid he would die of a misprint. And I think when we get into these kind of discussions, we have to be careful that we don't catch some terminal disease by some misunderstanding or misprint of conversation, right? So, of course, you've got realism, and it's all its various varieties, however you want to lay it out. And you've got postmodernism, which really underlies most of this debate, right? And people have the idea that postmodernism is the opposite or the contra-realism, right? But that isn't what it is, actually. All postmodernism says is we can't directly know reality, therefore we can't say anything authoritative about it. It's just how we react to whatever is there, right? It doesn't mean there is no reality. So when I hear talk of new ontologies, that bothers me, okay? Because by definition, you can't have a new ontology. If there is an ontology, it underlies our experience and we can't directly perceive it. We can't create a new realism in that sense. What we can create is new interpretations of our experience. And I think that's really what you guys are talking about. Of course. Right? So we need to realize that when we're using our jargon and such, that what we're talking about is trying to feel our way around that elephant that we're blind of, right? And if we do realize an ontology, means we may somehow have gotten access to the real underlying thing. And I'd love to have that happen, but you know what, I can't prove that it's happened to me or anybody else. So I think we just got to be humble, essentially. I'm not saying you guys aren't, but oftentimes when we start getting these discussions, we forget the value of humility, and that we are just trying, like everybody else in the human condition, to try and figure it out. And if we come up with new solutions that seem to work more in a utilitarian way for the biggest number of people, then we've made progress. But we can't assume that everything and every conclusion, every speculation, every hypothesis, whatever we generate, is necessarily going to be better than something's already happened before. So I guess all I'm saying, it's not a question, it's sort of a comment, it's kind of a cautionary statement, is I guess the best I can say what I'm trying to get across.
But I think I heard what you're trying to get across from these presentations.
And I think intellectual humility is super important. As human beings, do we really think we should be able to figure everything out? Like, isn't the world way, way larger than humans? Whatever it is. I mean, we're doing a pretty good job of destroying it. And I think in part, the question is, how can we, like, not destroy it, right? But yeah. Okay. That's it. Thank you all.
That's a good thing. Thanks.